Hey there, record heads. Make sure to check out bagsunlimited.com for your vinyl record supplies. Bagsunlimited.com supplies record stores and collectors around the world with protective sleeves, archival storage supplies, record storage boxes, protective vinyl shipping mailers, and tons of other durable solutions that'll keep your records safe for years. Just go to bagsunlimited.com and check out their audio and record supplies. That's bagsunlimited.com.
And now, on with the show. Welcome to The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. Here's your host, the biggest record nerd of them all, Nate Goyer.
Well, hey everyone, it's Nate. Welcome to episode 477 of The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. Ladies and gentlemen, this week we are welcoming Daniel House of CZ Records, Skinyard. He's a former Sub Pop employee. Daniel's a man who was there in the beginning, definitely deep in the thick of it, and still stands today, as evidenced by his new box set, Skinyard Select. That's 7 7-inch singles, recordings and remasters of Skinyard tracks produced by Daniel alongside music legend Jack Endino, which you can marvel at and purchase at skinyardselect.com. Now, today, Daniel and I discuss his pivotal role in the Seattle music scene of the 80s and early 90s, including his work running CZ Records, his time as an employee at Sub Pop, his experiences with influential bands like Nirvana, Melvin, Soundgarden, and lots more. We dive deep into the Deep Six compilation, the record that was the first time on vinyl for many of the Seattle legends. So some interesting tales on this one. You music nerds, I definitely hope you'll enjoy. And everyone, yes, I am back in Sydney now. Yes, I had a great time in California and hosting a tour of the Punk Rock Museum. Yes, I got some interesting interviews along the way. And yes, I picked up some amazing records. So make sure to follow us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. That's where I put up pictures of adventures and rare records. And hey, if you like this podcast, we have 476 other episodes available to enjoy anytime. Just select that follow button on your podcast app or the little plus sign, whatever you got, and you'll get access to it all, including episodes like 476 with Jeff and Stephen McDonald of Red Cross. That one's, I love talking to those guys. It's hilarious. That's episode 476 of the Vinyl Guide. Mac McCon of Superchunk and Merge Records, episode 471. Jerry Cantrell of Alice in Chains, episode 467. Henry Rollins, episodes 461 and 462. David Yao of Jesus Lizard, episode 460. Mark Arm of Mudhoney and Ed Cooper of the Saints, both on episode 455. And lots more. You get the free stream with words from our sponsors and the commercial-free experience by being a Patreon member at patreon.com/vinylguide. All paths to listening to the podcast are appreciated. And with that, let's get into our conversation with Mr. Daniel House of Skinyard and CZ Records. All right, this week on the Vinyl Guide, we are welcoming to the podcast Mr. Daniel House, who's been involved in a lot of different projects, including owner of CZ Records and purveyor of the Skinyard catalog, amongst many others. I believe that, did I introduce that right?
That's fine, yeah.
Excellent. And we're going to be talking about this Skinyard Select. It's 7 7-inch singles selected by yourself, Daniel, and Jack Endino, as I understand.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. All right. So tell me a little bit about these recordings. This is a kind of a box set. Hearing something new coming out of CZ is not an everyday occurrence. So very curious as to the project and how it was approached. Yeah.
Well, it sort of started a few years ago. I released my first physical release in 20 years. And that was a record by 10 Minute Warning. That was also limited to 1,000. I still have plenty of inventory available for people who are still looking for that. It was a sort of a proto grunge band from 1984 in Seattle. It was the last band that Duff McKagan was in Seattle before he went down to LA.
And no one ever heard from him again. Yeah.
Nobody ever heard from him. And this is not a record with Duff in it. This is actually the version of the band after he left. I was actually the bass player in that band for this set of recordings. And it was one of the two bands that ultimately led to the formation of Skinyard, or at least the concept of what Skinyard was intended to be. I'd been in two bands in 1984. One was 10 Minute Warning, which was, as I said, kind of proto-grunge, very heavy, kind of somewhere between Stooges and maybe some Velvet Underground flavors, kind of heavy psychedelic, very kind of dark. And then I was in this other instrumental, kind of more cerebral band with Matt Cameron at the same time. And we were an instrumental three-piece, and both bands pretty much imploded towards the end of 1984, about the same time. And I had this idea that I wanted to start a band that was kind of an amalgam of the aesthetics of both bands. And I had met Jack through feedback, and he had given me a tape where he played all the instruments on the tape. And I was like, I think this is the guy I want to start my next band with. So I called him up and said, hey, I have this idea for a band, and I think we should do it together. And that was kind of the inception of Skinyard.
Okay. And in the early day, well, even up to this day, Jack is a bit older than you and some of the guys in Skinyard. Was he the eldest, the elder of the band?
Okay. He was the eldest. He's probably 3 or 4 years older than me. I don't know exactly because he likes to keep it a secret. In fact, his age on Wikipedia apparently says his wrong age, and he's told me that he prefers it that way because nobody actually knows for sure. And it also means that people can't hack him
Okay.
or do identity theft. Anyway, in the creation of the 10 Minute Warning record, the designer of that record, which is Jeff Kleinsmith. I don't know if you know him, but he's basically the art director and has been, I think, for like 20 years for Sub Pop. And he's in another band he was in a band like 30 some odd years ago called Stymie. And actually, they just released a vinyl record of, I think, their complete recordings as well. And so we were working on 10 Minute Warning, and he just kind of off the cuff said, you know what you should do? You should do a 7-inch box set for Skinyard. And I'm like, that's a weird idea, but I like it. And I said, well, if we're going to do that, then you have to design it. And he goes, well, that's kind of why I'm pitching it, because I wanted to design it. As it turns out, he's not the designer on this box because he's just too busy with Sub Pop. So I ended up working with a very old friend of mine, Stephen Birch out of Portland, who also has background in music. I used to play in the band Sprinkler, and I think he was also on an Everclear record, if I'm not mistaken. I know he toured with Everclear a few times. So he goes back.
So 7-inch singles. It's a very deliberate set of numbers there. It's not 6, it's not 5, it's not 10. Why 7?
Well, I want to say the number was intentional from the get-go, but it probably wasn't. So the whole idea was to pull together a collection of songs that kind of spanned the entire range of Skinyard's existence while they were an active band, which is basically from 1985 to 1991. During that time, we released 4 studio records, starting with the self-titled record, then Hallowed Ground, then Fist-Sized Chunks, and then 1000 Smiling Knuckles. And the concept was sort of like, okay, if you've never heard the band, you know nothing about it, what's a good entry point rather than diving into a record? So we wanted to pull not necessarily the obvious songs, but the songs that Jack and I could agree on were some of our personal favorites and that we felt represented the band over the course of all of those records. And similarly, over the course of the 4 different drummers that were in the band during that course of time. And it was also important that we have a collection that feels cohesive, even though it was over the course of sort of several versions of the band. And we kind of spent a lot of time just going through everything and looking at different possible songs. And during the process too, Jack came across a song that was originally from the recording sessions for the first record. And that's actually the first song on the collection. That's when Matt Cameron was our drummer. And How it is that it never made it on the first record, I'm not sure. But what we kind of just ended up with 14 songs. We could have gone 12, but there were songs we wanted to include. So that's how it ended up.
So this is like, I guess, an entry point. If people want to understand Skin Yard, this is probably the place to start. This is
It's a perfect entry point, I think.
Okay.
Because the entire range of our output is represented. But what's cool is there's this previously unreleased song with Matt Cameron on it. There's several Matt Cameron songs. One of them is actually from the first record, but Jack did a whole new remix of it because I guess the mix always kind of bugged him a little bit. So there's a couple of remixes. There's a couple of alternate versions that have also, never been released before. Actually, one of the alternate versions did come out on the Start at the Top Odds and Sods Skin Yard collection from 2001, which only came out on CD. So every song on this collection is the first time it's ever been on the 7-inch format.
So for years, CZ Records has been pretty much dormant.
Pretty much. And digitally, it's been, it's on all the digital platforms. But yes, in terms of releasing new material, it's been dormant.
What does it mean to run a label like CZ in 2024?
I don't know anymore. I mean, because when I started CZ, I didn't start CZ. So Chris Hanzsek started CZ, but I took it over from him pretty early, I guess in 86. I took it over from him in 86 and, continued releasing for, I guess close to 20 years, 15 years, something like that. And it started in my living room as a hobby. And I was working in restaurants and saving tip money and, putting out records by my friends. And then eventually it just kind of continued growing and I didn't have to save money anymore because things started breaking even. And then eventually things started making money. And at that point I was actually working at Sub Pop as one of their very earliest employees. And at one point they let me go very unceremoniously. And I was basically faced at that point with the decision as to whether or not I wanted to actually make a full run at CZ being a full-time label. And I decided of course I should, because the worst thing that could happen is it doesn't succeed and I have to go back to restaurants or, let's make a run. So I did. And, within a few years I had a staff of like 13 people.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So let's go a little bit slower because CZ right. is it's a beloved label. Right. It's got some incredible releases to it. Now, I understand the first release on CZ was the Deep Six compilation.
That's correct.
You were on that, but you weren't running the label at that point.
That is correct.
Okay. And from a participant, I want to almost say observer in that first incarnation, you were in the Skin Yard, on the Skin Yard tracks. Yep. That album, that Deep Six compilation, is the first time people had heard on record. Soundgarden, I think that's Melvin's first record. Yep. Skin Yard, of course. Remind me, who else was on that?
Malfunction,
okay.
That's also the first time anybody ever heard Malfunction. And then the two bands that were also on who actually had releases prior to Deep Six were UMen. I think they had a couple of EPs at that point, and then Green River had a record out on Homestead.
Right.
And so that was kind of a snapshot of what was emerging in Seattle in, basically 1985. I mean, the record came out in 86, but all the recordings were in 85, and all of these bands were actively playing in 1985.
And when you were in Skin Yard, Chris and Tina, they approached you guys as a band, said, look, we got this idea for a compilation. What do you have? What was your, I guess, experience as an outsider now getting pitched to be part of this compilation?
I'm not sure if they pitched us or if I pitched them, but Chris was working on the record. I think initially he only had 4 bands. I mean, I would probably argue that the 2 bands that seem a little bit outside the rest of the record were probably UMen and Skin Yard. So I think he already had Green River. Soundgarden, Malfunction, and Melvins. And it like he didn't quite have enough at that point to do what he was looking to do in terms of, who the bands were going to be. Um, and I think I basically got wind of the fact that he's working on this record. And we were very much embedded in the scene with all of these bands. We had already played several shows with all these bands by that point. And so I'm pretty sure that I pitched him and said, hey, you should put us on it. And he agreed, which is great. And then I think other people have a different recollection, but it is my recollection that I am the one who basically talked him into putting UMen on the record. And because I recall him kind of being like, I don't know, they don't seem to fit. And I'm like, well, in a sense they don't, but they don't fit because UMen are such a distinct band all unto themselves. But they were basically one of the biggest bands in the underground at that point. Initially the two biggest bands around were UMen and 10 Minute Warning, actually. But 10 Minute Warning by then had broken up. And so UMen were still active. And I'm just like, if you want to sell records locally, you should probably try to get UMen on there because they will help raise the profile of the record. So they agreed to do a song and only one song.
So even those early days, you had the marketing hat on.
I guess I did. Yeah. Without trying to, but I've always kind of thought in those terms, I guess. I'm a natural marketer, whether I like it or not. And I kind of hate marketing. Like I've actually professionally, in other capacities in my life have had marketing roles. I've been director of marketing in a couple of places, and I kind of hate marketing because half the time it ends up just being bullshit. But
only half.
Okay, well, yeah, maybe more. But if you're working in music, not necessarily, because if you're working in marketing with things you love and breathe, then it doesn't feel like you're marketing because it's something you actually believe in,
Right.
And I think that's a difference is marketing is so often disingenuous because the goal is just to push something that you don't necessarily believe in. And that I think that's kind of at the core of why I tend to hate marketing.
Well, if you don't believe in it, then yeah, it's a bad word. But if it's something you do believe in and something you love, like the UMen or like whatever, like music, like a release, you want to talk about it. You want to enroll people in giving it a shot.
I want you to be excited about something that I'm genuinely excited by.
Yeah.
Sure.
So for Deep Six, was that entirely funded by CZ or did the bands pitch in at all on those?
No, the bands did not pitch in. It was all Chris and Tina.
Okay.
I believe Tina was the money part of that partnership because Chris and Tina were boyfriend girlfriend at the time. But Chris also had Hanzsek Audio, which later became Reciprocal Recording, and he quickly realized that running a record label is an absolute pain in the ass, and having a different business that's more of a service business, i.e. the recording studio, I think he found a lot more satisfying and, it was more immediate and he wasn't having to hustle because people were coming in wanting to use the services. And so, they were paying. So I think he quickly realized like, well, I can have a whole bunch of records under my bed, or I can have this studio that's, at the early stages, but it's taking off and doing well. And he was really good at what he did. And, it wasn't long before I actually brought Jack in as well as sort of the other, the other recording engineer.
Did the Deep Six compilation sell well initially? Was it something that kind of flew out or were they?
Absolutely not.
Okay. All right. Because now it's quite a collector's item right now.
Yes, it is.
Right.
But, that's because all the bands have actually been part of a pretty huge history, right? But at the time, there was no history, and Seattle was a tiny pinpoint on the map. And, I think initially maybe a couple or a few hundred copies sold inside of Seattle. And I think probably Chris was able to get like a handful of distributors, like, take take like 20 copies each, kind of. But these bands were essentially unknown outside of Seattle, so it was a hard sell. This is way, way before the World Wide Web existed, and you know, part of my deal with him and part of my inspiration with him in terms of wanting to take over the label was like, I will take the catalog you have and I will, at first I was buying like 50 to 100 at a time and kind of getting them out in the world and establishing relationships with distributors. But the goal ultimately was to put out records. And I knew that over time, if I put out more and more records, I would have more catalog and I would have an easier time working with distributors because obviously if you have one record or two records and you're unknown, distributors are like, they don't even know if you're going to be around in a year from
Well,
now,
you're the last
right?
person that gets paid at that point. So
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you inherited, I'll say inherited CZ, I don't know how ceremoniously it was passed over to you. When you took it on, they had Deep Six and Melvin's first LP or
Not even LP. It was a
EP.
6-song 7-inch.
Right. Okay.
And I later did a re-release of it with the other tracks from that recording session. I did a CD and a 10-inch or a 12-inch. I'm sorry, a CD and a 12-inch with 8 songs and 10 songs respectively. But yeah, that was it.
So, and you probably had a whole bunch of inventory left you had to move.
Oh yeah. Initially, like I said, I bought 50 or 100 at a time. And I would kind of sell through them and give him money for more. And eventually I just bought, the remainder of the inventory he had and just kind of went from there. And probably by then I'd released like 3 or 4 more records.
So let me ask you, because it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like CZ at that point was a bit of a liability, a bit of a pain in the ass. Why did you take it on with all its warts and problems rather than just start some of your own?
Identity, continuity.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there were already a couple of records on the label, and Deep Six, even though I didn't know yet that it was going to eventually become, for many people, the document of the scene that eventually became an international phenomenon. But I knew these bands and I loved these bands and I believed in them, and so to me, it seemed like we're off to a good start. Why recreate the wheel? Why start from scratch when at least there's a couple of things there that we can kind of use as a springboard?
Yeah, but I mean, it was a bit of a gamble,
Sure.
and it was a liability. Like I said, it was. I want to say in debt, but it did have a lot of inventory that was having trouble moving. What was the
Right.
reputation of CZ at that time?
Well, there wasn't really one. I mean, there were virtually no local labels at the time. So it was one of only a couple few local labels at the time. And, I mean, the scene was tiny. In 1986, it was tiny. I mean, the bands on Deep Six were playing out, and there were some other bands around. Feast was another band that was around, right? And like My Eye and Coffin Break, and there were a handful of other bands, but most of the bands that people relate to Seattle were not even in existence yet. And the other thing, like people don't really realize that there was a whole hardcore scene going on in Seattle at that time too, that weren't necessarily that people kind of tend to overlook. So some of the punk stuff was coming out like on Empty. That was one of the earlier labels as well. I mean, I don't know what the reputation might have been other than like, oh, cool, this label that's put out a few really cool records of bands we like. Because it was it was still very, very local. It took quite a few years before CZ became kind of more nationally recognized. And I think back then in the 80s, most independent labels did essentially start that way, right? I mean, you had Discord in DC and you had Touch and Go in Chicago, and you had SST in Southern California, and most of these indie labels at the time were regional labels, and then eventually they all became sort of much more national and eventually international.
But out of there's 3 or 4 you just rattled off, but there's probably 700 or 800 others that you've
Sure.
done. It's almost like you're the guy who went to the garage sale and bought that frame and opened it and found the copy of the Declaration of Independence in the back.
Right.
Because I mean, you have essentially what is the germination of this scene that's beloved to this day.
Yes. Yes.
Do you still have all the tapes and materials from those? You still have the master tapes of all the Soundgarden and Melvin stuff?
So, no, it's been quite a few years now. It's probably been about 30 years. A&M actually owns Deep Six at this point.
Okay.
So this was at the time when Soundgarden was basically getting signed, right? They had already been on Sub Pop and they had already been off of Sub Pop. Their record had come out on SST, the one that was recently remixed by Jack and re-released on Sub Pop, finally sounding like it should have sounded in the first place. And they were getting signed to A&M. And the contract that existed with the bands for Deep Six was kind of pretty sketchy, pretty easy to tear apart if you were a lawyer, I suppose. And Susan Silver, who was managing Soundgarden at the time, I think she saw the writing on the wall and indirectly kind of did me a solid, so to speak. It was A&M's interest to basically lock up any stray Soundgarden masters out there. And I don't know this for a fact, but I think they were probably willing to basically come after me legally. This is pure speculation on my part. Susan would have to validate this. But what she basically did is got me in touch with A&M so we could actually work out a deal where they would buy the masters for the entire compilation, basically just to secure the Soundgarden tracks. I don't think they had any real interest in releasing it, but part of the contract that I negotiated, I said, well, you have to release it at least as a CD because this never come out in that format at that point. It's still a young format back then. And so they did. And I said, you had to put a certain amount of marketing into it and this and that. And so they basically put out the CD. The artwork was slightly changed, adapted from the original LP. And, they did the minimum that they were required to do. They put it out and then they just basically let it go out of print. And I'm pretty sure there's nobody out there that even probably knows what they have at wherever the A&M masters live now. I don't even know if that's under like Universal or somebody else. It would be interesting to do a re-release, but I would have to license that directly through A&M, which might still be a possibility at some point. It would be a cool thing to do, I think.
So A&M bought the entire Deep Six compilation just to get the Soundgarden tracks. So they now own those Melvin songs. They own the Skin Yard songs.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like I said, I'm sure they don't even know because all the consolidation that's happened over the years. And, there's probably some, 26-year-old kid who's in charge of some catalog department somewhere overseeing, the masters from 30 years ago from like 15 different labels. And, it's just an entry in a database at this point.
Oh, that's interesting. And those tracks have not surfaced. Those Soundgarden tracks have not surfaced elsewhere. Any box sets or anything that
not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. So if people want to hear that early Soundgarden or those early Melvins, the only place to do it is to find a Deep Six compilation, either on CD or the original vinyl.
Now, the Melvins tracks that were on that first 7-inch, I did eventually sell them back to them, and they re-released it with a whole bunch of other early stuff on Ipecac. And I forget what it's called, but I think it's like Melvin's 20 songs or something like that. So it's just a bunch of early stuff, demos and those tracks and some other stuff. One of the 573 different Melvin's releases out there.
Yeah, I try to get them all. So all Melvin's recordings that were on CZ, with the exception of Deep Six, are now back in the hands of Buzz and Dale.
Yes.
Got
Correct.
it. Okay. All right. And if they want those early tracks, they got to talk to A&M for those.
Yeah. But I think there may be enough interest out there, for a re-release of Deep Six. And that might be possible. That would be really cool.
Yeah. If you could find someone who still works for A&M.
Yeah, in the next year, I might start doing some digging, asking around, find out, it would be pretty cool. And, of course, if we did that, I think the way to do it would be to have Jack remix the whole thing. So it's not just Deep Six, but it's
Deeper Six.
It's Deeper Six. There you go.
All right. Marketing.
If it happens and we call it Deeper Six, I will have to make sure you get a copy.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to hear that. So you mentioned in casual passing that you had a role at Sub Pop, and your role at Sub Pop was quite substantial. As I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you got that job at Sub Pop by picking up Bruce Pavitt from a bus stop.
Hey there, audiophiles. If you're seeking stylish furniture to showcase your stereo and record collection, well, look no further than SidetrackedWorkshop.com. Sidetracked Workshop designs extraordinarily elegant record cabinets and consoles that add sophistication and panache to your music hobby. Handcrafted in the good old USA in the vinyl-loving city of Portland, Oregon, Sidetracked Workshop's designs are a music lover's dream. Made with real walnut veneered wood and brass accents, these gorgeous designs add class and taste to the record room and ship fully assembled and ready to enjoy. Just check out the designs for yourself at SidetrackedWorkshop.com. Look, you spend thousands of dollars on records. Don't keep them in a crate, and don't risk your records on those feeble wooden pegs from IKEA. Your music deserves the dignity of Sidetracked Workshop. That's SidetrackedWorkshop.com. Elegant solutions for the vinyl lifestyle. Oh, and hey, record nerds, don't forget to clean your records with the very best and safest record cleaner, the Groove Washer. Make your records look and sound their very best and store them with confidence using the new Groove Washer Groove Guard record sleeves. You gotta try this out. It makes a huge difference to the quality of your vinyl experience. Ask for the Groove Washer by name at your local record store and accept no substitutes. Or head over to groovewasher.com and use discount code VINYLGUIDE10.
All hail the Groove Washer.
That's groovewasher.com, discount code VINYLGUIDE10.
So you mentioned in casual passing that you had a role at Sub Pop, and your role at Sub Pop was quite substantial. As I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you got that job at Sub Pop by picking up Bruce Pavitt from a bus stop.
Almost.
Okay.
I picked up Jonathan Poneman.
Oh, John Poneman. Okay.
So I was already decent friends with Jonathan. He had already booked. He was a Skinny Yard fan, and he had booked a number of shows for us at the Fabulous Rainbow. KCMU used to have these Tuesday night sponsored shows, and so he booked us a number of times. And I was working in a print shop, running the press and doing a lot of pre-press film stripping and compositing. And I worked for this Korean boss who was a screamer. And I don't deal well with screamers. And one day I just had enough, and I'm like, fuck this noise. I'm presuming I can say words like that on your podcast.
That's fine. Yeah.
So I just said, fuck this. I think it's the one and only time I literally just walked out of a job. And I'm like, because he was basically abusive. And I just got up and left, and I'm like, I'm done. See ya. And I hopped in my car, and I felt sort of, exhilarated, slightly terrified and uncertain, but I was in my 20s and whatever. And I'm driving along, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, there's Jonathan sitting at the bus stop. So I pull over, and I'm like, hey, can I give you a ride? And he goes, well, I'm going home. I'm like, well, let me give you a ride. And he goes, well, you live over that way, right? I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't matter. I got nowhere to be. I just quit my job. And so we're just hanging out, we're talking, driving over to his place, which was over on Queen Anne, and he just said, so, hey, I wondered if maybe we have this job opening, Charles Peterson was doing it, but he's not really cut out for this, it's a sales job and blah, blah, blah. And so I said, oh yeah, absolutely. He goes, who? And I said, me. He goes, really? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. So he goes, well, okay. So we talked a bit more and kind of carved out a few things and a few details. And he said, and this was, I think, on a Wednesday. And he goes, can you start on Monday? And I'm like, yeah, of course. So I started on Monday. And that was, I think maybe it was either 87 or 88. So when I started, it was Bruce and John and me. And my basic role and what I basically did on my own was create the entire network of direct to retail stores. That was a model that a lot of other indies started later, but at this time, Sub Pop was the only one brazen enough to think that we could sell COD to stores and completely bypass distributors. And we're like, yeah, well, here's the deal. You'll get our product cheaper. You can be guaranteed that you'll get better fill because, it was infamous that distributors would carry your stuff. People would order 10 copies of something and get 4. And so stores were always frustrated. And, the main issue that we had at Sub Pop was that we didn't really have enough different titles in our catalog. So I was like, we need to start distributing stuff, but we need to distribute stuff very selectively, very kind of curated material. And so I built, over the course of a couple of years, I built our entire direct to retail network to, I think we finally added Mark Prickerel as a second salesperson when I had reached 800 accounts because I just couldn't do it anymore. It was too much. And on top of that, I also was in charge of dealing directly with our distributors, getting all the manufacturing orders, taking care of all that, and also creating accounts with labels in both Europe and Australia to basically do distribution back and forth trades. So we became the de facto exclusive distributor for all the punk rock stuff that Waterfront Records was putting out in Australia. We were importing a whole bunch of stuff from Glitter House, which is also, they were distributing a lot of our stuff in Germany, but also licensing a bunch of stuff. And I was also working with a Dutch distributor and sort of trading stuff back and forth there. And then we started carrying a lot of indie stuff. And I wouldn't just carry anything that some small indie would send us something, and I would say, well, send it to us, let me preview it. And we would be very selective. And that's part of what kind of made our niche really special. So like I remember getting the very, very first Slint record when it was on Jennifer Hartman Records. And she sent it to me. I'm like, this is freaking cool. And I'm like, yes. I said, like, send me 25 copies. And she was all excited. And then, I pushed it. I said, this is a record you need to hear. You need to buy. It's cool. And I think over time, I end up going through several hundred. And so that was kind of the thing. Like, we didn't just carry anything from any label. It's like we had to like it because it was also representing who we were.
Right.
So I created this whole network of distribution, of sales, and I think at the peak, I was probably generating about $30,000 a month in COD, which is not bad for 1989.
I remember COD.
Yeah.
They don't do that COD anymore, do they?
I think they probably still have it. Yeah.
Really?
But
Okay.
I don't know.
I remember having to be home and just hand the postman, like $5.32 or whatever it was.
Or check, right?
Well, I didn't have checks at that time.
I remember. Anyway, yeah. So that was a lot of what kept Sub Pop afloat for those early days.
So for the international folks who may not know, COD, cash on delivery, I think. And so post office would deliver the package and the bill would be part of that delivery. So if you bought $10 worth of records and it cost $3 to ship it, there's a $13 bill that you would have payable before they handed you that package. And the post office managed all that back and forth.
Yeah.
$30,000 a month of that.
Uh-huh.
God damn.
This was all UPS. We used UPS exclusively.
UPS. Yeah.
Uh-huh. But it was
Now,
great. It was great. I mean, it was, we didn't, I mean, the thing is, we didn't even have a database at this point. We weren't computerized. So I had to create all of the forms that we would use. And we were using fax machine. Because keep in mind, this was before the World Wide Web. There was no email. So everything was pen and paper.
so how did you work with someone like Waterfront? Now, by the way, I should probably say I live in Sydney.
Oh, yeah.
And so Waterfront Records is very near and dear to my heart, and still very beloved in Australia, certainly Sydney, where the home base was at. So a lot of our heroes, Hard-Ons, Mass Appeal, a lot of these bands came out of the Waterfront camp. How did you work with Waterfront in days where it must have been just, like you say, fax machines and phone calls?
Yeah. I either wrote them a letter or I faxed them a letter. And I just kind of established that relationship. And it was great all around because all of our stuff made it to, was going through Waterfront, getting all over Australia, and all their stuff was coming in through Sub Pop and going all over the United States. So, previously where you might read about Hard-Ons or, various bands on Waterfront, it was really hard to get because you'd have to do mail order from Australia. All of a sudden now it's like, I can actually get it in my local store. So for people that were, big fanzine people, because that's how you got your information back then, right? It was college radio and fanzines, and you had the stable of fanzines that you tended to follow, and you kind of became aware of the labels that you were fond of because they represented the kinds of music you liked. So if you read, these fanzines and there was reviews of these records from Waterfront, all of a sudden they became available. So it was great.
A lot of the Sub Pop releases, they were available here on Waterfront. They're also on Agogo, I believe. So, that did Waterfront have first right of refusal and then Agogo, or do you remember how that relationship worked?
Our deal with Waterfront, I mean, at that time, it was strictly finished goods. We were literally sending them records and they were literally sending us records. So for any licensing stuff, that kind of came later.
Okay.
The one licensing thing that came through from Waterfront was they were doing the Hard to Believe Kiss covers compilation.
Okay. The red one, red record, I believe. Yeah.
Well, there's the initial covers, a painting of the 4 members of Kiss. It says Hard to Believe, a Kiss covers compilation. It was a gatefold with all this Kiss memorabilia in the middle. And they at this point we were talking on the phone regularly, right? And they pitched me saying, hey, do you think Sub Pop would be interested in licensing this? And I'm like, oh, that would be cool, because there was already a Melvins track on it. And so I brought it to Bruce and John. They're like, no, not interested. I'm like, really? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So I said, sorry, they're not interested. And they said, well, how about you? Do you want to put it on CZ? I'm like, really? I'm like, yeah, that'd be cool. So I was the one who actually got the Nirvana track for them on it. And I actually got several tracks from them and Coffin Break, and obviously Skinyard was also on that. But then I also got a couple of tracks, or no, you know what? I think I have it backwards. I got the Nirvana track. They didn't have Melvins. I got the Melvins track, but it only was on the US version and not the Australian or the European version. So I got a few tracks that were only on the US version. And the other thing is I thought there was a lot of filler, so I made it a single album instead of a double.
Yeah, it's a double on Waterfront. So
and also I forget who put it out in Europe, but it was also a double there.
Okay.
And I was just like, yeah, it'll be stronger as a single album, and I'm going to pull tracks off, and then I'm going to put a couple of my own on there that are only going to be on my version.
Okay, so you're running CZ while you're working at Sub Pop.
Yes.
That and how do you
and
manage that?
And playing on Skinyard as well.
Okay. Well, if you're playing in a band and working on a record label, that
makes sense.
That makes sense. If you're running a record label while working at another label, that could be a bit of a conflict of interest. How did you manage that?
Could be. I never thought it was. By being really strict about when you did which work for who.
Mm-hmm.
So on at Sub Pop at that time, we were all on a time clock, like literally punching the card, right? So I was really clear about the time I spent versus one versus the other. So sometimes I would come in early, do some CZ work, and then I would finish what I was doing, and then I would punch in and do Sub Pop all day long. Sometimes I would come in, start doing Sub Pop, and then I would clock out and I would stay like an extra 2 hours off the clock and do CZ stuff. It really wasn't that difficult, you know.
Just compartmentalizing kind of.
Compartmentalize, and I'm the kind of person that just feels it's really important in terms of like being principled in that way. You know, I had no intention of taking advantage of my role at Sub Pop to try to benefit CZ. You know, the only place that, you know, I mean, the CZ stuff was among the many labels being distributed through CZ. And so, you know, that was a sales channel for me. And also at the same time, I was also being distributed by Caroline, who's distributing Sub Pop as well.
Right. Okay.
So, you know, I think over time, perhaps Bruce and Jonathan may have considered it a conflict, but from where I was sitting, no, it was not, because I was very clear in my mind that the two needed to be kept separate.
Now, you mentioned getting that extra Nirvana track for that Kiss covers compilation.
Yeah.
And that's not the only Nirvana single or track that you were able to take out and put on various projects. How involved, like, walk me through the Nirvana recordings that you helped bring to light.
Hey there, all you record nerds. I want to tell you about BagsUnlimited.com. BagsUnlimited.com has a huge selection of vinyl record supplies. Whether you collect LPs, 7-inch singles, 78 shellacs, or anything in between, BagsUnlimited.com will sort you out. From polyline sleeves to cardboard record mailers to 7-inch storage boxes and archive quality record sleeves, protect your records of any size and shape at BagsUnlimited.com. Whether you have a small personal record collection or you're running a massive record shop, you can grab a small supply or even buy in bulk at BagsUnlimited.com. And they've got some really incredible, unique stuff. BagsUnlimited.com even has special size sleeves made especially to protect your box sets, storage boxes and sleeves for cassette tapes, protective supplies for reel-to-reel, and yes, even 8-tracks. Just go to BagsUnlimited.com, click on Audio Supplies, and prepare to be impressed by all the options they have. That's BagsUnlimited.com.
Walk me through the Nirvana recordings that you helped bring to light.
Well, the first one is Mexican Seafood, which was on the very first Teriyaki Asthma single. So Teriyaki Asthma was a series that I put out of 7-inchers that each one was 4 different bands. Very similar and actually inspired by the Amphetamine Reptile compilation of Dope Guns and Fucking on the Street. Slightly different in terms of the fact that, you know, Tom Hazelmeyer did all the graphics for Dope Guns, whereas I would hire a different graphic artist for each one of those singles. And obviously our aesthetics had some overlap, but then a lot of, you know, different. I think generally speaking, CZ was a more varied label in terms of the kinds of bands I might put out. But the very first one had a Nirvana track. You know, Jack Endino, the Skin-Yard's guitar player, recorded their first set of demos as well as their very first record, Bleach. So I had heard all of those demos well in advance. Jack brought in the tapes literally the weekend after he finished doing the demos. And this was before they had a proper drummer. So the demos were with Dale Crover on drums. And, you know, we were based on that, those demos, Skin-Yard was like, we got to have them play a show with us. So the first of 4 times that they opened for Skin-Yard was that year in '88. And finally got Chad Channing in as their drummer, and we played this show, just the two of us at Squid Row, which is this tiny little club on Capitol Hill. And they were not a big band yet. They were kind of small peanuts, but they were quickly gaining fans because they were a fantastic band, and they were, undeniably so. So back then, I could call any of them just at home because I had their number and I was friends with them. And, so I called Kurt and I'm like, hey man, I'm doing this series, Teriyaki Asthma, and, could we use one of the songs from the first set of demos? And he's like, yeah, totally. So that's it was very, very informal. That track later got re-released on Incesticide by A&M. And they were kind of pissy about it in that they wouldn't even give credit to the label. They wouldn't say it originally appeared on CZ Records. But, whatever.
A&M was pissy or the band was pissy? Actually, it was Geffen, wasn't it?
Or Geffen, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm getting one. Yeah. It was Geffen. Yes, correct.
Okay.
It was basically... I could say the band was pissy, but really it was by then the machine that was surrounding the band at that time. The way I found out about it was I got a call from Rosemary Carroll, who was their attorney, who was also Danny Goldberg's wife, and she just called me out of the blue to basically put the fear of God into me, and she succeeded. And she basically told me in no uncertain terms that this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to go down. And if you try to block us in any way, shape, or form, we will ruin you. That was basically the gist of, it didn't need to go down that way, but apparently she felt that it did. And I was actually shaking by the end of that call and had to leave and go home early because I was so upset.
It's a bit when Don Corleone offered the check to Johnny Fontaine's band leader.
Very, very much. So, I tried calling the guys at the band at this point to go like, hey, dude, like, I'm not looking for money, but could you at least give me credit? And at that point, Nirvana by then was huge, and, they were being protected completely by any outside interests and sort of being insulated. So I could say the band was pissy, but I think really the band was taking instructions like, you need to not talk to anybody from this point forward because, at this point, Nirvana was the meal ticket for a lot of people, and so I really think it was the larger organization built around the band than it was the band themselves.
So it sounds to me like when it came to Soundgarden, they purchased Deep Six. You got a check for that. But with the Nirvana tracks, there was no check.
No, but it was one track, right? And the one consolation was that Rosemary Carroll said, because at this point, Teriyaki Asthma 1 through 5 had already been released on both vinyl and CD. And at that point, she goes, we're not going to keep you from continuing to use it on this compilation. So be happy.
Right.
But of course, one of the main reasons why people were buying that comp at that point was because of Nirvana. And once it was out on Incesticide, my sales pretty much dried up.
But it's a collector's item now. So there's that. And the track for the Kiss covers compilation, that was also forfeited?
I don't actually know because I got the track for Waterfront and then subsequently for my version and the European version. But I just basically coordinated that recording and the delivery of that recording. But I never owned it personally. I was just the person that sort of enabled that recording to happen, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. So when Nirvana released Bleach on Sub Pop, it sounds like you were squarely in that organization when that was happening.
Absolutely. 100%.
There was a first pressing of Bleach, which I believe was a white and a marbled version that was recalled or it was shelved because there was some problem with the pressing. Do you recall anything about that?
No, but what I do recall is the recall of the cassette. So I don't know if you remember the Blue EP out on Gary Held's label. What's the label called?
It
I'm
was a
forgetting.
UK label, right?
It was a UK label, correct.
Yeah.
So there was the Blue EP, which had two of the tracks from Bleach on it. And so when we sent them the tracks to press Blue, we literally took the tracks from the original masters, literally cut them out of the masters from Bleach and sent them over.
Right. Okay.
Because that was kind of Sub Pop's MO back in the day, was they weren't the most detail oriented all the time.
And a new tape would have cost money. So a transfer would have cost. So
it still would have been worth it. So what happened then is we were getting ready to do the big leap and do a different format, right? Because so far it'd only been vinyl. And we put out the cassette, and we got the cassette master back that had to be approved before they could press it. And all of that came through me, but I didn't do the approval. So I was dealing with the pressing plant, I was dealing with the distributors. And so I got the cassette, and it was in Jonathan's office. And I'm like, dude, I need you to listen to it. Yeah, I'll get to it. Dude, I need to listen to it. Yeah, I'll get to it. It's like, we have a deadline. We're going to miss our deadline if we don't get approval soon. I need you to listen to it. And finally I'm like, all right, where's the cassette? I'm going to listen to it myself. And he goes, no, I'll do it. I'm like, okay. I'm coming back at like whatever, 4 p.m. today. If I don't hear from you, I'm grabbing it and I will sit down, because, it really required you to sit down, put it in, and do nothing else, right? Just listen to it. Well, he did finally put it in and he played it, but he was on the phone talking to people the whole time. It was just in the background. But he said, it's approved. And I said, okay, great. And I gave approval. And I want to say it was like 5 or 10,000 pressed. It was a lot, because, by then Nirvana was starting to take off, and cassette was a pretty big deal format back in the day, right? And a lot of people were buying cassettes. And after everything had been pressed, somehow word got back to us that it was missing 2 songs, because the 2 songs had been pulled from the record and was on the Blue EP. So instead of instead of a 10-song record, it was suddenly 8 songs. And so we had to do a recall on the whole thing. And here's the thing. Here's the Sub Pop, the label with 9 lives story, was that we recalled them and very few came back, because suddenly it was a collector's item and everybody wanted it, which is completely absurd to me, but it could have been disastrous from a financial standpoint. And yet we recalled it. Everybody's like, no, we're good. And they sold, and then we released the proper cassette with all the songs on it later, and that was that.
And those people probably bought another copy of the other cassette.
Probably did.
You step in shit and smell like roses.
Yeah, pretty much. And Sub Pop, they just were so kind of clumsy about things back then, and yet, they just had this amazing record of it was the label with 9 lives. It really was.
Were you involved in the singles
club?
Yeah.
In a manner of speaking. Not entirely, because what would happen is we had limited pressings, right? And it was that whole subscription model. And it was basically a way to generate money up front, but it was always like taking money from here to pay that, because we were always kind of behind on things we had money to. So it was a way of keeping the lights on, but
that was direct to consumer, and you seem to be
direct
going
consumer, but we would often have pressings in certain amounts available above and beyond the subscription base. So like if we had 800 or let's say 1,000 subscribers, but maybe there was 1,500 records or something like that, we had a certain overrun available that we would make available to sell to, key retail accounts. So sometimes people would still get them.
So people you liked, retail accounts that you liked,
Oh, we
could
couldn't
have
offer them to everybody,
yeah.
usually, because it was usually a pretty small number. And of course, over time, that subscriber base grew and grew and grew. So eventually it was only available that way. It was also great though, because you could send the singles out, and then you had this, every package that goes out, you put in a mailer of all the mail order stuff that the whole catalog. So it was a super smart idea.
Captive audience. Yeah. So there's probably at one point several dozen Love Buzz singles, which you were then able to offer to retailers and friends. Okay.
Yeah. And, regarding Bleach, like I've said over the years that I basically sold the first 50,000 copies of Bleach. I was the person selling them to, 800 different retailer accounts all over the US. And I was the one basically working with Caroline directly, getting them orders as well. So
what do you recall about the posters that were in the original copies of Bleach?
Not a lot. I remember that there was one.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, we're over what are we, 35 years ago?
Maybe more. Because it seemed to be something that would happen with Sub Pop. The first Tad record had the poster in the first 10,000 copies or whatever like that. And so the Nirvana poster, that's one of the ones it's a bit of a holy grail for collectors, which is why I wanted to understand your experience with that.
Yeah, I don't remember. I remember that at first we had a poster and it was kind of exciting. I mean, there's this other story that I tell sometimes about how when we were doing Nirvana, I had this conversation with Jonathan, because at that point, Mudhoney was the singular focus of the label. Like, it's Mudhoney, it's all Mudhoney. And I liked Mudhoney, but I liked Nirvana more and I liked Afghan Wigs more. And I was like, Jonathan, I really think you're backing the wrong horse. I think you need to put more money into marketing into Nirvana and Afghan Wigs. And he was like, well, I appreciate that you like these bands, but we're going with a sure thing. I'm like, okay. And even Jonathan was like, yeah, I said that. And I mean, the thing is, the label was so small and so strapped for cash at the time that they had to make the decision between this band versus that band, as opposed to, they all get money, because things were just too tight. So they had to kind of hedge their bets. And, I think at the time, Mudhoney probably was a safer bet. They were a bigger band at that point.
At what point did you realize that you were sitting on that Deep Six compilation and these bands are just starting to break here and there?
It was probably 88, because by then, 88 or 89, at that point, everybody, Melvin's had a bunch of records. UMen, I don't think they'd broken up by then yet, but they were already a big deal. Soundgarden at that point was already on, but very much on their trajectory. And, they had already been on Sub Pop, and at that point they had come out on SST. So yeah, Melvin's had put out several records by then. So, at this point, Sub Pop or Seattle at this point had started its trajectory. I mean, it wasn't 1991 yet, but bands were getting signed, bands were going on tour, bands were, even if they weren't getting signed to majors, they were still putting out records. Screaming Trees were on SST at this point. I mean, there was a number of bands putting out records by then. It was like in 85 and 86, that wasn't really the deal. But by 88, 89, a lot of records were coming out.
What's something that you've seen that a lot of people get wrong about the Pacific Northwest scene?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure it would be somehow related to, there's this whole idea of that the scene always existed like that it was always this huge thing. And of course it wasn't. For a lot of us old timers looking back at the early days, you know, we probably sort of miss the days when it was really small and intimate and insular. You know, I mean, Seattle was a tiny little town that most touring bands would skip. For a lot of us, we would have to go up to Vancouver or down to Portland to see a lot of our favorite bands when they were on tour. And it was really only after bands started getting signed that there started being attention.
Right.
You know? I mean, not entirely. You know, we had clubs like Metropolis earlier where a lot of bands would come through. But like prior to Metropolis, they were kind of fewer and far between. And bands would come through, but a lot of bands wouldn't. I think for a lot of young people just discovering the Seattle music scene, they start at 1991.
Yeah.
Everything was happening, you know. So this is when all these big grunge records came out. And of course, it was also the year that Skin Yard broke up. So our timing sucked. But
Yeah.
you know, I mean, we're able to come back and put out this release now, and you know, it's kind of exciting. And if nothing else, it's an awful lot of fun doing this project. You know, and everything's been remastered. You know, like I said, several new remixes, song. We're doing several videos for a bunch of the songs that are brand new
Oh,
videos.
I noticed there was two different types of pressings. There's the red pressing and a pink pressing. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And the pink pressing's 200, very limited.
Yes. So
The red.
800 red, 200 pink. Now, you know, there's usually a little bit of overage, so it may be a little more of each. We'll see. Because when you press records, you always have to do like 10% over and under. I mean, it's always over. So we shall see.
There's a lot of times there's a secret pressing as well. Like
There's what?
a secret pressing as well, like
Right.
25 splatter or something like that.
This won't happen here.
That won't happen.
Unless it's sort of an accident, but I don't think it will, because these are there's no mixes, and I have to do certain minimum pressing, so I don't unless they surprise me, but it's nothing I know about.
Where are you getting impressed at?
I'm getting impressed at through Memphis Vinyl Pressing, or
Fat Possum,
but
yeah.
but they actually use, for all their 7-inchers, they do everything in the Czech Republic.
Okay.
It's the same pressing plant that Pirates Press uses.
Right.
And they're actually, I think, they found a problem with the seventh 7-inch. They suddenly found this nick in one of them, so they had to go through the entire run, and they found 387 that had the nick. So they literally had to print new labels. They had to and then it's a 24-hour period for them to fully dry, and then they're having to press the difference. So they're sending me the first partial batch in the next day or two, and then they're pressing the remainder, and they're going to send those separately.
So those 387 or so with the nick, they junk those, or do they give you the option to say, "Hey, do you want a collector's item?"
They junk them because they're flawed.
Right. Okay.
So it'll be the 200 pink and the 800 red.
Well, I'm glad someone's paying attention. QA.
Well, I think eventually they got a lot more professional in their operation, but in those early days it was super punk rock. But you know, this is, I mean, it's a great release. There's 7 individual 7-inchers. They're all on colored vinyl. They're all on really nice heavy duty stock for the sleeves. I think you've probably seen the artwork, right? This Ohio artist named Mike Egan did all the paintings. I licensed the individual ones, and then the actual heavy duty outer slipcase, he actually did a painting just for this release. So that'll be exclusive to that, and it feels nice to hold. It's nice and heavy, and they're all top loaded. So when you pull them out, you see the art, and you pull the records out from the top.
Looks like a gorgeous box. So is this kind of a kickoff of CZ 2.0?
Probably not. And if it were, if there was a CZ 2.0, it would be the 10-minute warning record a few years ago.
Right.
You know, the thing is, like, it's not cheap to press vinyl anymore. it's really expensive. Like this is by far and away the most elaborate project I've ever done. And as a result, it's also the single most expensive project I've ever done. So I bet a few people balk at the price, but I don't think the price is unreasonable to be perfectly honest. For what it is. Somebody said something on Facebook like, "Oh, that price, sticker shock," and I'm like, "Dude, think what it's 7 singles in a custom slipcase." Which, by the way, I had to have the template for that was exclusive just for this project because they didn't have one, so I had to pay a fee just for that. And I said, honestly, I could buy a pretty nice used car for what I'm spending on this thing. So, it's going to take quite a few just to come to break even. But it's worth it. It's I don't know. I hope people like it, it's just in time for Christmas.
Okay, so people order, they will have it under their Christmas tree.
Yes, I think so. I'm going to start shipping December 2nd. So if I can make a little pitch, if anybody wants a copy, right now it's pre-order. After December 2nd, it'll be order. But you can just go to skinyardselect.com and it will take you to the page where you can order pink or red.
Okay. Because I was going to say skin-yard is
just one word, skinyardselect.com.
Got it.
And the pink ones are $10 more than the red ones. But, I can guarantee it'll be one of the most beautiful packages anybody here has ever seen.
Gorgeous.
Test pressings sound amazing. Jack Endino gave him his thumbs of approval. That's all I need.
Excellent. All right. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us here and putting up with our record nerd and grunge Nirvana questions.
I love it.
You were a very central figure in a very captivating era of music. So
yeah,
I'm sure you've got tons of more stories and things like that. Good luck with this record. It looks
so
beautiful. Much. I hope to get my hands on a copy. skinyardselect.com. Again, Daniel, you're welcome back anytime, mate.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
All right. I've always wanted to have him on, so very glad we were able to make that happen. I did get my hands on one of these Skinyard Select box sets, so I'm going to be doing an unboxing video here shortly. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide for that. Or you know what? Just simply buy one. skinyardselect.com. It's like $100. It's a really cool package and it's very limited. So make sure to grab them before they're gone. skinyardselect.com. And that's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Please share these episodes on social media, put them in Reddit forums and Facebook groups, leave us positive reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That is always appreciated. And we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, get out there and buy some records, people. Cheers.